Am I audible? Audible?
Yes, sir, you're audible.
Great. They'll go away.
So the slides are on their way, the introductory slides. Well, let me welcome you to this 104th edition of Thursday Musings. A very
clear.
Yeah. So let me mute everyone. Okay, the host has muted everyone. Only the panelists can unmute themselves. Today's topic is important because it is the way a new how the psychiatry therapeutics is being enhanced by the so-called previous psychedelics. So welcome to this 104th episode. Next slide, please. Handing over the session to Professor Dr. Tufan Pati, sir. He is the chairman of the program. He's from Cuttack. Sir, over to you. Sir, please unmute. Tufan, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Alim, and welcome everybody. Welcome to this 104th episode. And I shall be introducing the moderators and chairpersons from the whatever I have from my mobile phone. Dr. Alim Siddiqui, आ गया? स्क्रीन में आ गया? ठीक है. So Dr. Alim Siddiqui and Dr. Amrit Patadoshi are our efficient, vibrant moderators all throughout. Both of them are active members of Indian Psychiatric Society. Dr. Alim Siddiqui is the treasurer. Dr. Amrit Patadoshi is a much involved executive committee member. Both of them are professors of psychiatry, and they have a lot of.
Next slide.
Next slide. Next slide.
Next.
Next.
Yeah.
And our chairperson, esteemed chairperson, is Dr. Arun V. Marwale from Aurangabad. He is presently chairperson of Professional Realization Task Force of IPS, president of IPS Western Zonal Branch. He is ex-chairperson of Membership Committee, IPS Western Zonal Branch, Managing Committee member, IMA Aurangabad Branch, Professor, PG and PhD guide, ex-HOD Department of Psychiatry, MGM Medical College and Hospital, Aurangabad, MGM Health University, member of Academic Council, MGM Health University, Navi Mumbai, member of Board of Trustees, Psychology, MGM University, Aurangabad, consulting neuropsychiatry, Shraddha Nursing Home, Samta Nagar, Aurangabad, honorary treasurer, IPS Social Security Scheme, National Advisory Board member, Indian Association of Private Psychiatrists. Awards he has received: Rakhmaji Borude, Manasastra Award for rank first in MA Psychology, conducted EM University 1997. Rashtriya Sanman Award from National Education Human Resource Development Organization, New Delhi in 2004 and 5. Welcome, Dr. Marwale. And we have with us other chairperson, Dr. Anup. Next slide, please. Dr. Anup himself from Kochi. He is Deputy Medical Superintendent and Professor and HOD of Psychiatry, FNIMS Kochi. He is Secretary of Indian Psychiatric Society, Kerala State Branch. He is Convener of Disaster Management Task Force of IPS. He is Member Secretary of Institutional Ethics Committee. Won Best Secretary Award of the Year 2013-14 of Rotary International District 3201. He is managing the Child Guidance Clinic at Nazat Hospital, Aluva. He is conducting tobacco assessment workshops for staff, interns, postgraduates, and general practitioners. Managing tobacco assessment clinic at St. John's Medical College 2007-8. Served as President of House Surgeons Association 2000-2001. A study and relation between antisocial behavior and heart rate in school-going adolescents. This study got Best Thesis Research Award for the year 2006-07 from IPSCR Research Society, St. John's Medical College, Bangalore. Welcome, Dr. Anup Singh. And with this, I hand over the further proceedings of this meeting to Dr. Marwale and Dr. Vincent, our esteemed chairperson, and please take over from now onwards. The CV of the speaker will be displayed, and you can introduce it. And you can introduce and then introduce the topic.
Dr. Arun, you can start, sir. Arun, sir, you can start.
Arun sir, please unmute.
Yeah, actually, I was trying, but host muted me. That's why I couldn't. Thank you, organizing committee. At the outset, I thank specially Dr. Topan Pati, Alim Siddiqui, and Amrut Pattagoshi for giving this honor of chairing this session. As all of us know that we are facing challenges right from beginning. I mean, right from ages or decades prior, there were so many disorders, physical disorders, which claimed lives of hundreds of people. That was actually the pandemic they faced. The same thing that happened recently. We have evidenced the pandemic of corona, and we have seen a lot many people were near and dear even were lost. As all of us know again that whatever happened, so the changes were there in medical therapeutics also. So initially those disorders which were or diseases which were not treatable later become even curable. The same happened with psychiatry also. Initially there were no drugs, as all of us know. So they were segregated in asylums. Later on, around 50s or 60s, some of the drugs were available and they targeted the neurotransmitters. Later, the receptors. And now we are talking about the neuroplasticity we bring in certain disorders. And now the molecules are trying to induce neuroplasticity as early as possible. And that's how help the human community, particularly mentally ill people. So with this, the speaker, Dr. Ashwin Mohan, is going to elaborate on this issue, the changing scenario of psychiatric medications. So Dr. Ashwin Mohan is a senior practicing psychiatrist from PGI, Chandigarh. He has done MD from PGI Chandigarh. He has done PG DMLE from NLSUI Bangalore in year 16. He is a senior practicing psychiatrist in Chandigarh. He has his own clinic. His major areas of interest are addiction psychiatry, forensic psychiatry, mental health, policy and law, and advocacy. He is currently an EC member of IAPP, EC member of APSI, and co-chair of IPS Addiction Psychiatry Specialty Section. So with this brief introduction, I would like to hand over the mic to my co-person, I mean co-chair, chairperson. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Arun sir. Actually, this is very quite a novel topic for a discussion. So I am not getting better into it. I think the better person is Dr. Ashwin Mohan. And I think we will listen to him, and after the discussion, we'll have a fruitful discussion. And so I just invite Dr. Ashwin Mohan to get into the discussion, please.
Please stop the slide share so that Dr. Ashwin can proceed. Yeah, thank you. Ashwin sir, you can proceed now.
Dr. Ashwin, you are muted. You unmute yourself, sir, please.
Ashwin sir, your audio is not coming out. Coming up. I think your audio device is not connected. It is showing not connected.
Connection got cut.
Yeah, you are back now.
Can
Yes, yes, we can hear you, sir.
can you? Am I? Yeah. So the connection got cut. So, with the permission of the chair,
You can share your slides, sir, but if you have any problem, you can
hello.
WhatsApp the slide to us. We will share it from the by the support staff.
Okay. 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 So thank you, Chairperson. Am I audible and visible?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. So thank you, Chairpersons and the organizing committee for inviting me to give this talk on psychedelics, transforming psychiatric therapeutics. Now, psychedelics have been in use for thousands of years by humans, and before the 1960 prohibition era, when it was included in the Controlled Substances Act, and finally in the 1961 Convention on Narcotic Drugs, they were used extensively in the 1940s and 50s as part of psychiatric treatment. And because of this prohibition, there was a lull in research and use for treatment purposes for the next about 30-40 years. But the late 1990s and 2000s showed a resurgence in the use of psychedelics for treatment purposes. With this, I'll begin my presentation. If there's any problem or a technical glitch, please let me know beforehand. So this is one of the early descriptions of what a psychedelic experience is. Eyes closed, back to the dancing workshop, incredible joy, beauty, the wonder, thanks for the chance to see the dance, all hooked together. Everything fits into the moist, pulsating pattern. A very colorful, beautiful elaboration of what a psychedelic experience is, and this was given by Timothy Leary, who was one of the pioneers of research with DMT in the early 50s. These figures show what magic mushroom looks like and what kind of experiences are there, and there were many books earlier too regarding this kind of experience. So my talk is actually in two parts. The first part would be on introduction to psychedelics, evolutionary and historical backgrounds and importance, mechanism of action on brain and effects, and role in improving human cognition. So I have decided to actually put it in two parts. Without going into the historical and evolutionary background, it is really difficult to understand why we are at this level today. And so the second part would actually deal with treatment. So this particular session will be restricted only to the first part. So what are actually psychedelic drugs? Psychedelic is a neologism that combines the words psyche and delion. So psyche means the soul and delion means to make visible or reveal. Thus, it actually means mind revealing in a very simplistic sense. It is preferable to the term than the term hallucinogens, the term which actually suggests that principally these particular substances produce hallucinogens. So psychedelic drugs do produce hallucinations, but they are not only hallucinogens. They have many other effects. The term hallucinogen is often used to as a rather broad category to include all kinds of psychoactive molecules, including cannabinoids, ecstasy, dissociative agents, and others. So we need to make this distinction between psychedelic drugs and hallucinogens. The name psychedelics for these substances was actually coined by Humphrey Osmond in 1957, connoting that they have a mind manifesting capability, revealing useful or beneficial properties of the mind. Now you see, a lot of the earlier descriptions were based on what the visual and sensory experiences were, because obviously the technology and the ability to explain other kind of sensations was not there during the early 50s. So a lot was focused on the immediate experience that people felt at that point of time. And Jaffe's definition is probably the closest to what we can define as what are psychedelics. The feature that distinguishes the psychedelic agents from other classes of drugs is their capacity to reliably, meaning consistently, to produce and induce states of altered perception, thought, feeling that are not experienced otherwise, except in dreams or at times religious exaltation. So, again, a more elaborate definition of what psychedelics are. But psychedelics cannot be fully understood without reference to a number of other fields of research, which include anthropology, ethnopharmacology, psychiatry, psychology, sociology, and others. So bear with me for a few minutes because I will be describing the human evolution part and what psychedelics potentially or probably played a role in brain growth and evolution over thousands of years. And this is very interesting because we can't de-link of what happened thousands of years back and to understand what is happening today and why we are here today. So psilocybin mushrooms containing mushrooms were found on all continents except Antarctica and across all ecological zones. So they were heavily prevalent. Early hominins meaning that current humans are early ancestral humans and very closely related humans, were omnivores that relied substantially on forest floor foods, including mushrooms. So when foraging actually started a few thousand years back, mushrooms and other foods were eagerly harnessed for purposes of nutrition and for other uses. So psychedelic mushrooms from the genus Psilocybe were ingested by our ancestors since the Pliocene period beginning about 5.3 million years ago. So it's a very, very long history of use of psychedelics. So this is just a schematic timeline of use showing thousands of years back how these psychedelic substances were started to the current situation, that is 2020, where now we have many trials being done by prominent universities such as Johns Hopkins and other places, and especially in the UK in the Imperial College London and Mount Sinai College of Medicine. So we have reached a very long way from the earlier uses of psychedelics thousands of years back to the pre-1950s era and now in the early 2000s. So what happened? The human brain actually doubled in power about 200,000 years ago. Why did it happen? This is considered to be a so-called missing link, and no clear reasons have been attributed as to why this brain growth took place suddenly. So this schematic diagram with the skull shows how the brain growth has occurred suddenly over about 200,000 years ago. And you can see an exponential growth in the size of the brain. And this other diagram too shows how the brain sizes have increased about 5,000 to 10,000 years back. This actually gave rise to what is called as the stoned ape hypothesis, whereby it was considered as or asked when did of human consciousness. So there were many theories which came up, which actually put psychedelics as one of the major tools by which our human brain actually grew after ingestion of that psilocybin and other such psychoactive substances over thousands of years. This is, of course, a very simplistic model, but it is a very interesting model and which we need to understand about how this came about. So there were two seminal books earlier in 1990s and later in early 2000s. One called The Food of the Gods, which made a case for psychedelics playing a very strong role in human evolution and adaptability. And another book, which is called Darwin's Pharmacy, which also deals with plants and use of these substances and how they have played a role in growth of human brain, and subsequently evolution and survival. So actually typical psychedelics such as psilocybin and lysergic LSD modify the brain processes central to perception, emotion, cognition, and the sense of self. This is very, very important to understand that psychedelics actually modify the processes related to perception, emotion, cognition, and sense of self. This is the key central tenet which has led to evolution of the human brain. It could have had direct effects on the adaptation of early humans by enhancing their ability to live in highly social cooperative communities. It may have enhanced the participation in collaborative activities with shared goals and intentions, basically between humans and human communities and human societies, and expanded the core of human sociality, again through cultural transmission. So one is about collaboration between different communities, and that collaborative activity is transmitted via culture and innovation, which leads to further adaptation of the human society. So this brings me to this concept of what is called as the human socio-cognitive niche. And the central theory of that is that psychedelics acted as an enabling factor in human adaptation and evolution. So what is a niche actually? A niche is a structural, temporal, and social context in which a species exists and defining its mode of adaptation. Simply put, it's the environment where a species grows and survives and evolves. So it's a structural, temporal, and social context. How are humans different from other animal species? I mean, we have very many differences, but there are two key differences which we all know and which I must emphasize on. One is the cognitive niche, that is our brain, our ability to think, our intelligence, our ability to plan and execute ideas. That is called what is called as cognitive niche. The second is that we have a deep social mind. We have a way of thinking characterized by profound mental intermingling and group mindedness. We have this propensity to form small communities, larger communities, societies, civilizations, and which are characterized by uh, uh, cooperation, collaboration, and coordination between different members, which is not really seen to that degree in other animals. So a cognitive niche and a social niche is what distinguishes humans from other animals. So how did this manifest? How do this psychedelics actually cause become an enabling factor in human evolution? Four methods or four tools have been uh, elaborated. First is management of psychological distress and treatment of health problems. Now, psychedelics did have a lot of effect on reducing psychological distress. So we must understand early humans, when they started going down from trees to the ground, it was a very stressful period. And hunting for food, animals coming and hunting them, and other issues, health, illness, diseases, new pathogens. So it was a very stressful period. So one of the ways by which psychedelics probably helped was in management of these psychological distress and treatment of health problems. Second is it improved social interaction and interpersonal relations. So it helped humans cooperate with each other in signaling danger, in signaling food, and help in survival. The third is facilitation of collective ritual and religious activities. Once we evolved into societies, what happened is that ritualized behavior started developing. So what is the role of a ritualized behavior? It's the basic function of enhancing coordination, cooperation between human beings and human societies. Rituals all often have this goal related to survival and reproductive success, such as curing an illness, harming a rival, and these ritualized behaviors, which began thousands of years back, are still continuing. And we know what are the benefits of such behaviors, and we see this in religious rituals and social rituals, and we continue to do that. So they had an adaptive use, if I may say, uh, till this time. The last method by which it happened is that enhanced group decision making is intimately linked with strategizing and decision making through its central role in diagnostic forecasting. Now, what happened is that certain people who used to take uh, uh, these psychedelic substances and experience these sensations were considered special, like shamans or religious leaders, and they were looked upon to provide direction and leadership to other humans. And this too was one of the methods by which it probably enabled evolution. So, management of psychological distress, improved social interaction, facilitation of collective rituals, and enhanced decision making. So this slide shows a schematic uh, uh, diagram of what the socio-cognitive niche is. And this, I'll just briefly explain it to you. So what happened? Ingestion of psychedelic plants and mushrooms leads to enhancement of cognition, sociality, communication, and social learning, which I've already described. It also led to the emergence of socially constructed environments such as sharing of information, group mentality, altruism, pro-social leadership, and rituals. Both of these factors led to modification of selection pressures and adaptation, and hence led to an enhancement of the socio-cognitive needs, finally leading to the growth in brain, growth in society, and the evolution of the human. So again, this is probably very simplistic, but an interesting theory to explain what could probably be one of the reasons for why our brain growth increased at a few 100,000 years ago. So this is not how we generally think of what uh, psychoactive substances can do, but it is important to understand the background by which where we are today, where we have reached today, depends on what happened to our brains thousands of years back. So classic psychedelic substances comprise of three main classes of chemicals. So I won't go into too much of detail, but just for completion, there are plant-based indolamines, including psilocybin. The second class is phenylalkylamines, which include mescaline and amphetamines. And the third group is semi-synthetic ergolines called LSD. So plant-derived indolamines, phenylalkylamines, and semi-synthetic ergolines. So psychedelics induce their psychological effects primarily via 5-HT2A agonism, receptor activation, and modulate neural circuits involved in mood and affective disorders. So remembering that 5-HT2A is the principle of receptor activation which occurs. However, as we will see later, this is also very simplistic. So there are what are called as classical and non-classical psychedelics. And classical or serotonergic psychedelic compounds are so-called because they mainly interact with the serotonergic system, and most of them derive from plants or semi-synthetics. The non-classical can be synthetic ones, or which may target other receptor systems. There are what are called as dissociative anesthetics, and they trigger psychedelic-like effects and a dissociative-like state. And dissociation refers to the disruption of usually integrated functions such as consciousness, memory, emotion, and behavior. And what a third distinguishing substances would be empathogens and enactogens. They do not induce a full-blown distortion of perception and consciousness. So again, we are today focusing mainly on the classical psychedelic substances. Coming to this extremely difficult and complex way of how psychedelics act in the human body. As you know, thousands of years back, we've been ingesting psychedelics and they have co-evolved with our human brain. So serotonin is just one of the neurotransmitters which are involved. And now over the period of time, we have learned that psychedelics have profound effect on multiple brain systems, multiple neurocircuits, and multiple transmitters. And it's a very fascinating area of research, and a lot has been done over the last 2 decades because it's an opportune time because we have the tools and techniques now to elucidate what the mechanisms are potentially are. So what happens? There is a receptor activation and signaling, mainly in the serotonin system, but LSD and other ergolines also act upon the dopamine and adrenergic receptors. So the activation of 5-HT2A, which I said earlier, located in the the cortical and subcortical structures is the unifying mechanism through which psychedelics mediate the various behavioral and psychological effects. I mean, I can go into receptors and subreceptors and subreceptor types, but it won't really help. What is important to understand that 5-HT2A is the primary receptors which are involved. However, as I said, this is simplistic, and the actions are actually complex, involving other neurotransmitters, especially glutamate and neurocircuits. There is also regulation of neuronal activity. I'll come to a schematic diagram later on to explain all these factors, but we must remember how these psychedelics act, how these substances act. So there is regulation of neuronal activity. Now 5-HT2A receptors are highly expressed in the cortex, and particularly expressed in the prefrontal cortex, also on the presynaptically, synaptically on the thalamocortical efferents projecting to the neocortex. There is the inhibitory GABAergic interneurons in the cortex and subcortical structures also express 5-HT2A receptors. So it's richly expressed in areas of the cortex and prefrontal cortex, thalamocortical efferents, and the GABAergic interneurons. So what happens? There is an increase in the frequency and amplitude of spontaneous excitatory postsynaptic potentials and currents. So first, there is an increase in the frequency, increase in the amplitude of all these sensations. Second, they may exert different modulatory effects across cortical regions depending on the dose, specific drug, and the density of 5-HT2A receptors. Please understand that all psychedelics are not of the same category. They don't act completely in the same manner. They are different chemicals. So they do have different effects. And today I will not go into details of every single psychedelic substance because that would be impossible to finish in one talk. There is it also modulates the glutamate system, and there is an increase in glutamate release and a subsequent activation of the post-AMPA receptors, and increases NMDA receptor mediated transmission. So basically, it increases 5-HT2A transmission and glutamate transmission indirectly. There are also neuroplastic effects, as Dr. Marwale had said. So what are neuroplastic adaptations? The brain's ability to reorganize itself by forming new neural connections throughout life. Neuroplasticity allows the neurons and the brain to compensate for injury and disease and to adjust their activities in response to new situations or changes in the environment. So this is basically what neuroplasticity is actually about, but the mechanisms are quite complex. And these neuroplastic effects underlie the persisting symptom improvements observed in many psychiatric disorders which are treated with drugs. So psychedelics promote neuroplasticity via glutamate-driven AMPA receptor activation, and AMPA receptor activation increases the release of BDNF, of course, the prototype of nerve factor, which is essential for many synaptic synaptogenesis and neuroplasticity. Psychedelics induce both structural and functional changes in the cortical neurons, and they are mediated through many pathways such as 5-HT2A receptor, tyrosine receptor kinase B, and mammalian target mTOR of rapamycin or mTOR signaling pathways, and many other different pathways, primarily through these pathways. So there is a huge amount of neuroplasticity which takes place after psychedelic ingestion. There is also altered connectivity and activity of the brain. The principal amongst these is the altered thalamic gating. The thalamus is crucial in gating or filtering of the flow of internal and external sensory and cognitive information to the cortex. And these are mediated through the glutamatergic, corticostriatal, and corticothalamic pathways. I'm sorry, I'm going to a little bit of detail into neurobiology, but it is important to understand all of these. So, and also by serotonergic and dopaminergic neurons. So it is proposed that psychedelics disrupt this thalamic gating by stimulating these neurons, and thus there is information overload in the cortex and subsequent disruption of the integration of the cortex. This causes an increase in sensory perception, cognitive disturbances and ego dissolution, which we see in psychedelic states. So the altered thalamic gating system leads to an increase in information and the disruption of the cortex, leading to increase of sensory perception, cognitive disturbances, and ego dissolution. So again, this is a schematic diagram to explain what I was saying earlier. So what happens? A psychedelic experience occurs, which leads to a disbalance between the signals from the thalamus to the cortex. So there is an increase, this dark line shows that there is an increase in uh, uh, the signals, while the less dark lines or the gray lines show there is a decrease in the signals to the association cortex. So what happens finally is that there is a reduction of thalamic filtering of interoceptive and exteroceptive stimuli, and leads to decreased connectivity between association cortices and the brain, and an increased connectivity between sensory cortices and the rest of the brain. So this leads to a decrease in integrative processing and increase in sensory processing, basically a disruption. So again, it also leads to alterations in network integration. I'll skip this, which I've already described earlier. The important theory which has been used to explain the mechanism of action of psychedelics is what is called as altered entropy. Now, what is entropy? Entropy is a measure of uncertainty about a dynamical phenomenon, in this context, neuronal fluctuations across time. So the fluctuation in the neuronal activity over a period of time is called as entropy. Now, what does this model state? It states that it reduces the precision of high-level priors or expectations, and concurrently increases bottom information flow, which I explained earlier. This renders recurrent message transfer more sensitive to modulation by the ascending afferent, thereby increasing the entropy and complexity of accompanying neurodynamics. What happens is that the amount of information increases. Simply said, the amount of information increases. Also, the amount of neuronal activity increases, which leads to disruption and disintegration of the cortical function, and this leads to the final psychedelic states and psychedelic effects that we see. Again, this is a schematic diagram of what happens and the complexity and different uh, receptors and neurotransmitters which are involved. This again shows how complex it is, not as simple as just stimulation of the 5-HT2A receptors. That is one of the ways, but as we can see, it leads to genetic changes. So just to summarize, there are three main things which happen. There is an increase in global connectivity, which we see in this first diagram. There is an increase in entropic brain activity, which I described earlier. And there is an increase in single neuron excitability. So increase in connectivity, increase in global brain activity, and increase in the specific neuronal excitability. These three levels, we can understand how psychedelics actually work. So this would actually be a kind of a summary slide to explain all the things which happen. And then finally, as we say, these major changes which occur lead to changes in micro changes in the circuits and also in the gene expression. This is all good about what are the structural changes, but what actually happens functionally? So when we see functionally, what do psychedelics actually do? They alter the emotional processing, and this is very, very important because this is what is used in the treatment aspects. So finally, as clinicians, we are interested in what happens functionally. We can always discuss about theoretically about what happens in structural changes in the brain and genetic changes too. But what happens functionally? There is a change in emotional processing. There is a change in self-processing. There is a change in social processing, and there's altered sensory processing. The four major areas of change: emotional, self, social, and sensory. Of course, I'm not going to discuss about treatment aspects today. That will be in part 2. But I will explain what is the basis for including these as treatment agents. So altered emotional processing is that psilocybin and LSD increase both positive and negative mood. They increase emotional excitation and sensitivity and can lead to emotional breakthroughs that we see in psychotherapy assisted treatments. They may have a continued positive effect on emotional processing and mood that may normalize the negative bias observed in major depression. It may allow patients with depression to inspect emotionally loaded self-relevant thoughts which keep recurring and the memories from less judgmental and a decentered stance. So it helps the patients to inspect or think about or evaluate emotionally laden thoughts and thus become less judgmental. And this is done in the context of a psychotherapeutic session. What about altered self-processing? So it has profound impacts on various aspects of the experience of self, including loosening of self-boundaries, oneness, unity, or ego dissolution. And these are also considered central to the efficacy of psychedelic assisted therapy. And self-dissolution associated with feeling of oneness or what are called as mystical type experiences, which we have read about or patients or people who use psychedelic substances describe, has been shown to be positively correlated with treatment success. It leads to a degree of decentering, that is, a state that allows a broader spectrum of thoughts and patterns of emotions which may be beneficial. So rather than a narrow, rigid kind of thought process that we patients of depression or OCD or other illnesses think about, it may lead to a sense where there is decentering occurred and it allows more number of thoughts, a broader number of thoughts to come and the patient to evaluate these thoughts and thus may lead to evaluation of those negative thoughts and change of certain thoughts to a more positive stance. Altered sense social processing. This is also an extremely important component. What happens? They increase emotional empathy. That is the capacity to feel with other people. They reduce the feeling of social exclusion and social rejection processing. So may help withdrawal. They increase interpersonal closeness, increase in pro-social behavior, and also social cognition and behavior. So you see, it has multiple pro-social and uses or pro-social effects that we see by people who use these kind of substances. And finally, this is the altered sensory processing. It's the most frequent and robust features, and probably the feature which excites most people the most. I mean, what kind of experiences they have, sensory experiences and the colors and the vivid dreams and the mysticism that people explain. And this is probably the most important thing which people want to know about. So it produces a dreamlike state characterized by alterations in visual processing. Although the auditory and tactile perceptions are affected to a lesser degree, there is alteration in visual percepts, rarely representing true hallucinations. So they're not actually true hallucinations, but rather illusions or pseudo hallucinations that can be distinguished from real perceptions. However, this is seen mainly in moderate doses. So in much higher doses, they could actually be true hallucinations. Psychedelics actually increase the excitability of the visual pathway, and there is a disbalance between perception and integration, which leads to this kind of a visual experience. What is the importance? Mental imagery is often based on autobiographical memories and activation of related emotions, and therefore these are used. This mental imagery is used to change certain thoughts and patterns that a patient may have, and may have long-term benefits on psychosocial functioning and well-being. So a summary of what functional changes that we have seen earlier. So it leads to changes in emotional processing, self-processing, and social processing, and leads to normalization of negative bias, reduction of rumination, improvement in patient-therapist relationship, reduced social withdrawal, reinstatement of reward processing, all important components of what a treatment should constitute. So this sensory process is what Friedman described very beautifully, and I think summarizes what an experience is. So one basic dimension of behavior, Friedman was one of the earliest researchers and pioneers in psychedelic research. The capacity of the mind to see more than it can tell, experience more than it can explicate, to believe in and to be impressed more than it can rationally justify, to experience boundlessness and boundaryless events from the banal to the profound, deep, colorful explanation of what an experience is. So a functional changes that a person experiences while being on either recreational psychedelic use or via therapy. But it doesn't end there. There are immunomodulatory and anti-inflammatory pathways which are activated by psychedelics, and they have a role in being anti-inflammatory agents. And this diagram, of course, not for today, but shows how different ways psychedelics can affect the immunomodulatory and anti-inflammatory cytokines, and also gene expression. Very complex, different psychedelics affect. It also affects sigma-1 receptor. And what are these sigma-1 receptors? And sigma-1 receptor is a protein that can be found in the cell membrane, bound to mitochondria, bound to DNA chromatin material too. So you see, psychedelics just don't have these kind of functional changes or in sensory, emotional, or social processing, but it also actually affects the cell and the genetic expression. So it goes beyond that. So we can see how now we can correlate what thousands of years of psychedelic use by our ancient or ancestral humans could possibly lead to changes in genetic expression and may have played a role in evolution. So now we can connect the dots about what possibly could have happened over thousands of years. Again, speculative, we will not exactly come to know, but it provides evidence of how this could have happened. So as sigma-1 dysregulation is implicated in neurodegenerative and psychiatric disorders, as well as systemic illnesses, and it elicits pro-homeostatic, neuroprotective, and immunomodulatory outcomes. So one of the major areas of research now with psychedelics, apart from psychiatric disorders, is also neurodegenerative disorders, which I will discuss in the part 2 of my talk. So again, this is a schematic slide showing how it works. So what are the implications in health and disease? The results which are there, which show implicate that the 5-HT2A receptor system are important for treatment of depression, addiction, possibly borderline personality disorder, and thus provides targets for development of novel medication. It offers the unique opportunity to investigate the role of 5-HT receptor systems in human perception, cognition, and emotion. Because we have elucidated many mechanisms of how these psychedelics work, and thus we may be able to actually find out how receptors or sub-receptors actually help in treatment process. The importance of targeting and studying specific sub-receptor systems, I've already said so, and they have been shown to act rapidly and to have long-lasting effects, even after a few doses, in stark contrast to current treatment approaches in psychiatry. One of the hallmarks of psychedelics or psychedelic assisted treatment is that one, they have been shown to act rapidly, immediately, within a few days or so of using psychedelic. How that happens, the exact mechanism is not known, but as compared to say antidepressants or antipsychotics, which take weeks to months to act, this is shown to act rapidly. They have long-lasting effects, and sometimes a couple of doses, 2-3 doses, is enough to have effects lasting for weeks to months. Again, a process difficult to elaborate and difficult to understand, but yes. So two very important drawbacks of our current treatment. First, is the speed of action, and second is how long do they have these effects. They may actually be taken care by psychedelics. Although I must add that the exact mechanism underlying the therapeutic effects are still not understood, as with many other foreign molecules. It is unclear whether the therapeutic effects of these substances are the result of direct effects on brain activity and connectivity or due to cognitive and psychological experiences. So what this means is that is a psychedelic experience necessary for therapy, or can we have a therapy without any psychedelic experiences? Again, this is still in the realm of infancy, and we need to do much more research to find out if we can actually develop psychedelic agents without having these kind of experiences. So it's an open question for now. The field needs to still uncover individual predictors or biomarkers, and this is of course our eternal search going on for many molecules and many psychiatric disorders, is to uncover predictors or biomarkers. And even in the case of psychedelics, this has not happened. So, is it time to change your mind, or should I say brain, because lots of people don't want to use the word mind about psychedelics? Maybe. Psychedelics stimulate neuro and gliogenesis and reduce inflammation and ameliorate oxidative stress. They are promising candidates for future therapeutics for psychiatric, neurodegenerational, and movement disorders. And psychedelics hold the promise for being disease-modifying agents and not simply providing symptomatic relief. So there is promise, there is potential in the next probably 5, 10, 15, 20 years. The greatest disservice done to humankind. I just have one slide, Aline, no more. I think one or two slides. The greatest disservice done to humankind was probably the Controlled Substances Act and the Single Convention of Narcotic Drugs and the NDPS Act, and such acts in all over the world by different countries, which has completely stopped research into promising molecules, promising therapeutic agents. It was a prohibition which completely quelled research, and we could have saved thousands and thousands of lives if research was allowed in many of these plant-based substances, not just psychedelics, but there are many other plant-based substances which can prove to be useful therapeutic agents. So your assumptions to your windows are your windows to the world. Scrub them off once in a while or the light won't come in. This is true for substances like psychedelics or other so-called addictive substances. We have to shed our biases and prejudices. Without that, we will never see them in a different light. We will never accept them as true agents of change or true treatments that can be used for the benefit of our patients. This bias has been dinned into us over years and decades, and if we are able to just remove a part of it, it will go a long way in accepting newer molecules which we consider as so-called addictive. Why is this important? It's important because psychedelics have hardly or very few side effects. And you'll find that surprising, but that's this I will elaborate in the next part. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir, for a trance-inducing session. Over to chairpersons for their opening comment.
Okay, thank you, sir. Mohan sir, basically, I thank you for such an excellent and elaborative discussion on psychedelics and hallucinogens, and probably future use for the human purpose, particularly for bringing the happiness in these people having some mental illnesses. So I request Dr. Anup to summarize all the things before we go for question and answer session. Thank you.
Thank you, Arun sir. Actually, before getting the topic itself, it was so exciting because this was a very new topic for me also. So that's why I told after the session only I can give a comment on this thing. And this is something like a Netflix series, Ashwin. I'm waiting for the next this thing to come at the earliest, so that we can have a full-blown picture of the psychedelic use, because you have thrown an area which is actually really unexplored. When we all psychiatrists has not done, I don't think whether we have been thinking in that way. And really like a lot of areas, like especially certain kind of depression, or even the borderline area, borderline personality. And my question is there in the chat box, like that emptiness and social rejection in borderline. Most of the times we cannot touch that with any medication. We cannot touch that. So I feel well, most of the explanation what is told about this psychedelic drugs will open a new arena of treating a lot of the unresolved questions what we face in our clinical setup. So with this, we can take the questions, sir. Thank you. It's a real nice presentation. Waiting for the next series to come. Thank you, Ashwin.
Thank you.
Sir, thank you so much. So we'll carry forward from Dr. Anup sir's question. Hello. Use of psychedelics in empty feeling and rejection in EUPD. Are these a subset of patients who are more prone to addictions? Should they be given these molecules, or such type of molecules should be kept away from this subset of our clients? Dr. Ashwin.
Yeah. So as I said that I was going to deal with treatment related issues and everything in the next part, and I restricted myself to basically neurobiology and understanding the basic understanding of and the basis of what these will be related to treatment, because that's what we are interested in. But I would like to say really request everybody to keep their questions about treatment for the next session, and I will address most of these questions, and then we can probably go. So forgive me. I mean, this is probably not what we expected this time.
Sure,
So,
sir.
but
Sure.
yes, I mean,
No issue, no issue. We'll take the.
So
Dr. Anup has to come next time.
Yeah. So I mean, every
That's done, sir. We will not take that question.
Like
we will not take that question, sir. It's fair. It's fair.
Ashwin sir, a generic question. You talked about them being a disease modifying agent. So what are the possibilities? In what ways can they modify the diseases as we currently understand?
So, okay. What happens is that initially what was thought is that psychedelics would just have these kind of experiences and have little role in other treatment processes, except as like other antidepressants or so. They would cause certain changes in symptoms, and then once you stop the medication, then they would revert back and relapse and get back. Although we know that there are synaptic changes with other psychotherapeutic agents and psychoactive drugs too. But here what we see is that basic research has shown that there are many other changes at the genetic level which occur with psychedelic substances. And many of these changes continue over periods of months. Sometimes it has even shown that it has continued over a year or so. After a change, use of 2-3 doses of drugs, not more than that, once in 2 weeks, once in 3 weeks, except for in certain treatment regimes where it is done in microdosing, where it is given regularly, but otherwise 2-3 doses and the changes are seen over a period of weeks to months or even a year or so. So obviously it's not just symptom resolution, it is change something basically in the neurons and cells and the circuits which leads to these prolonged changes in the brain.
So, sir, what cluster of symptoms, what type of symptoms would be helped by these medications?
Yeah. So what is basically said that so-called internalizing symptoms seem to be helpful more, so-called, because this classification of internalizing, externalizing is not used anymore. But depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, um, uh, obsessive compulsive disorder, where we have all these recurrent thoughts, ruminations, negative biases, uh, borderline personality disorder, substance use, whereby there could be dysphoria and craving in alcohol dependence, even in nicotine dependence. So these are the kind of broad group of substances where psychedelics have been found to be useful. So one of the areas of research is to find out how it can be useful in such a broad range of disorders. So this is still an unanswered question as yet. But yes, these are the basic group of disorders where it is found to be useful.
Sir, Dr. Jagjot wants to ask how would its use be in resistant depression, schizophrenia? I think we should take it in our next session, this question, or you want to answer it now?
Yeah, I will take it in
Yeah.
next session.
Okay.
Dr. Ashwin, yeah, you talked about, brushing of.
In schizophrenia, it is found to be especially psychotic. Yeah, yeah.
कुछ नेटवर्क इशू हो रहा है क्या?
हाँ, I think so. Ashwin sir, if
अश्विन
you
बॉस, कैन वीडियो को ऑफ कर दीजिए अपना, थोड़ा स्लो है आपका नेटवर्क.
if you want to, Dr. Ashwin, if you want to.
Are we audible?
I switched off my video.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm audible.
Audio is better now.
Audio is better. You talked about brushing of the windows, opening up newer areas for research and all. So there's a question, what are the ethical issues involved in conducting research in this area, use of psychedelics? So,
Yeah. So as with every substance, first of all, the biggest issue is there are illicit substances. So you need a large amount, you need regulatory approval first and the permission from ethical committee. Secondly, they are they are psychoactive and they change the neurons and the mind. They're mind altering to say. So one has to be very careful, make sure they do not cause any harm to the patient. So it's done in a very regulated setting that the treatment is done. A very regulated setting whereby you have actually two doctors. In many settings, you have two doctors. One is a guide and one is facilitating the therapy to understand what is happening and what is not happening, and to help if the patient is having some kind of an adverse experience. So it's done in a very regulatory setting. So there are definitely ethical issues involved in this, particularly because of regulatory issues mainly. But if we are able to reduce some of these things, then probably we might be able to benefit the patient much more. What is important to understand is there are very, very few side effects, short term and long term. And of course, we need to choose the patient profile properly because it can lead to psychotic breakdowns and psychotic increase in patients of schizophrenia or increase in hallucinations. So one has to be very careful. One can't be very frivolous in using these agents.
So what do we actually do? We dilute the product and then we administer?
Yeah, so there are different dosage forms which are used depending on the kind of psychedelic agent which is used. For DMT it's different, for LSD is different, for psilocybin is different, and for other substances such as MDMA, ethamine. And so there are different doses. So yes, there are low doses, medium doses, and higher doses. So depending on that, different substances. It is not possible really to describe each and every substance and the dose of every substance which can be used right now, because that it would just be it will be very difficult to understand and remember anyway, and most people would not be interested in that. So I try to provide a more kind of global scenario regarding psychedelics.
So you're saying that it doesn't have many side effects. So what about those cultures, those group of people that they were heavily taking psychedelics? So any
Yeah.
study? Any outcome of those?
We don't really know how often or how much they were taking, and we also don't know what is the concentration of these substances which were there in, say, mushrooms, or the kind of mushrooms which were there earlier. Let's take it as a prototype. So we really don't know what was the amount. It is quite possible that they were toxic to certain humans, but for certain humans who were able to metabolize it, they provided these kind of sensory experiences, and then they were able to use it to their advantage. What is called as instrumentalization, that is, to use a concept or an idea or a tool or any kind of substance like this for their own benefit and for the benefit of the group. So that's what probably happened. So we don't know how much they were using, or what concentration it was, how frequently it was. But yes, it was continuously used for thousands of years. That is true, because there is enough evidence to show that through anthropology and ethnopharmacology and ethnobotany.
Amrit,
I'll come to the basic thing. I was talking about state of decentering. So Dr. Nachiketa has asked a question. Sir, can this state of decentering be related to loosening of association? We have talked about the concept of decentering. So, Ashwin boss.
Yeah. So losing of associations. Yeah, losing of associations. If you were talking about sensory disintegration and yeah, the reduction of ego boundaries and that feeling of oneness and self, then yes. What happens is that this kind of situation allows a greater number of thoughts to come. So a person is able to evaluate different thoughts, whereby, for example, in a patient who is depressed, he may get only a few negative thoughts, and he will keep ruminating on that. But what happens is that once you get a larger number of thoughts, a broader range of thoughts which come, you might be able to evaluate those different thoughts, and you might actually do it in a objective manner. So decentering, being detached to an extent, and being able to evaluate those thoughts to check whether some of them may actually be useful for them for in terms of treatment. So that is what is decentering, simply put.
Sir, you belong to the group of psychiatrists in the country who actually advocate for no laws in terms of regulation of addictive substances. So you're quite vocal, you're quite focused on that issue, and you're very passionate about it. So when do you actually think that psychedelics like LSD, will be legalized or at least come under the regulated use like ketamine? You think there is any hope in this direction?
You see, there is a lot of, let me put it this way. I don't believe in complete liberalization or legalization. I believe in less regulation. One. Two, the problem with the prohibition is that you are putting every single substance on the same platform, which should not be done. There are many substances which have very few effects, have very few side effects, and are not addictive or very less addictive.
Like
That distinction.
for example, sir, can we
Psilocybin,
just
cannabis is less relatively addictive. LSD and other psychedelics are less addictive. Heroin, of course, is more addictive. Cocaine is more addictive, and things like that. But these are other many substances which are relatively less addictive, less harmful. So unless we make a distinction between these kind of substances and not put them under an umbrella term and prohibit everything, that is the issue. It is not about making heroin freely available or cocaine freely available. Second, what happens is that, like in psychedelics, there are many such beneficial therapeutic substances which we do not explore, and we have reached a standstill where we have only antidepressants, antipsychotics, and there may be many other dimensions to treatment rather than just focusing on mood or focusing on reduction of hallucinations and delusions. But we are not there to explore those things. It doesn't give us an opportunity to do that. That is the second reason why I'm against this kind of a regulation. So when you're talking about whether this will happen in the future, in the West there have been many regulatory agencies which have allowed trials. Currently, there are about 50 trials which are going on psychedelics in the US and UK. That's not a small number, really. And possibly the FDA has declared certain substances as breakthrough therapies, and they're allowing research in that. So it is a possibility that they may be available in the future in a very regulated setting, whereby the therapist is actually been trained or explicitly trained to deal with such substances. So they may not allow everybody to do it, but only certain people who have been trained in that area to be allowed to do it. That is a definite possibility. The second problem is that currently we are focusing on treatment resistant issues still. So this might not be a first line agent, although they could be later on, but we're focusing on treatment resistant issues. So they may be reserved for those few percentage of people who are not responding to other conventional treatments, while in fact they could be candidates for first line treatments too. Why should we wait? And if they fail treatment, we might say, oh, this therapy has failed, when actually they have probably failed most therapies. So we are reserving them for those patients who are probably not going to really respond to too many things in any way. So I think it could be that in the next 10, 15 years, we might be allowed regulated use of these substances. The problem, of course, is upscaling them, making them largely wide or widely available. That is an issue because we'll still restrict it to certain conditions, certain centers, certain treatment doctors, therapists who are trained into it. So it will never reach probably the masses who may require many of these substances. I don't see that happening soon.
Okay. So the way it seems to be positioned, uh, would these be the actual happy pills that people are looking for? Because antidepressants will just decrease depression. This will increase the joy, the happiness as the part was there. So are these the future happiness pills possibly?
If you're asking are they euphoriants, they could be euphoriants, but temporarily. The acute intoxicating effects are there, which show that you might feel happiness or euphoria. But the chronic effects do not show that. The long-term effects don't show that a person is actually feeling those uh, sensory changes. What we see is normalization of their condition. So I won't go so far as to say that they are happy pills. And why do we need happy pills? Why don't we need normal pills to make us feel normal rather than having a state of continued and consistent happiness, which itself is probably going to become pathological at some point of time. So we should be focusing on feeling normal pills, whatever the normality is. I'm not going to go into definition of that. But the point I'm trying to stress is that we should differentiate between the acute effects versus what are the long-term effects that we see in a patient of, say, depression or anxiety.
Sir, how much is the time lag in the onset of effect?
Uh, I'll come to that in the next part, but
Yes.
briefly, you see what happens is that some effects are seen the next day itself, just one day after use of psychedelic substances. They continue over a period of weeks in some patients, and sometimes they continue over a period of months, depending on kind of treatment regime is done. But remember, this is done in a psychotherapeutic setting. So you need that therapy to continue and enhance and build upon that acute experience. It's still not known whether that can it be done without the therapeutic setting or not. It's still an open question. So whether that psychedelic use in a normal clinical setting without a therapist, will it work? To what extent will it work? Or do we need that therapeutic experience along with it? It's still an open question because that has not been explored.
Sir, one question that it always comes to mind: what are the risks of psychosis due to overstimulation of the 5-HT receptors? I don't know. That is
Yes,
in normal
that
vulnerable individuals.
that is that definite risk is there, and it has not yet been tried or advocated in any uh, psychotic conditions as yet. Uh, but probably I'll deal with this question later
Next,
and come to I'll provide some
uh,
kind of a
we will not take any
explanation.
more questions, sir. We'll take next week, sir. Then, Alim, I think, sir,
Uh,
we're
No, I
covering a
mean,
lot of things.
I deliberately put it in two parts
So
because it is
we'll
difficult
take a
to
lot of
explain
questions
the
next time.
treatment aspects and the basic neurochemistry and
Neurobiological
neurology
questions. We'll take
in
next year.
one particular talk. It was
the
going to
Sure.
be
next
very
time,
difficult,
is the next
cumbersome probably.
okay, or it should be modified by Dr. Sukumaran?
Pardon?
Is the name psychedelics okay, or it should be modified from Dr. Sukumaran?
Psychedelics are a generic name given because of what the experiences are there. It does not reflect the actual mechanisms of action, really. And it has a name which caught on in the 1950s and 60s because of that experience which was created by ingestion of these substances. So in a sense, it's an attractive term, but by no means does it explain the mechanism of action, just like probably antidepressants and antipsychotics, which we are questioning even now. So right or wrong is difficult, but it's an attractive term and probably uh, cause lots of other people to uh, take it up and read about it. And we've been fascinated by these experiences for years. Everybody wants to know what happens in a mystical experience. Probably lots of people want to experience it, whether they can or not is a different issue.
So Tufan Pati sir, what do you? Chairpersons, if they have any closing remarks, Chairperson sir.
No closing remarks, but I wish to thank all of you, Alim, Amrut, Topan Patti sir, and Anup sir, and finally Ashwin Mohan sir. Thank you.
I also thank.
सर हम लोग बच्चे हैं, हमको सर मत बोलिए.
I also want to
Take our name,
thank Tufan Pati sir, Amit brother, and Alim sir for giving the opportunity. And it is you are all waiting for the next session. Somebody has posted that please share the link for the next session now itself. So Ashwin, you are an hero.
Hot in demand. So next,
Yeah, you are in demand.
yeah, Ashwin sir will be back next week.
Yeah.
Yes,
Complete.
yes. So
Thank
next
you.
week will be only focused on clinical aspects and treatment aspects, nothing on neurobiology and nothing more, very burdensome, I would say.
We might
for
have
us
two
normal-
slides, sir,
normal people.
2 to 3 slides of this presentation, and then we'll move to your presentation.
Yes, yes. I'm planning to have a kind of
Yeah.
a
3 minute or 4
background
minute
of what
blitz.
we did.
Yeah, background.
Okay.
There may be one or two people who may not have attended. So
Alim needs
I will-
revision, sir. Again, Alim needs 2 to 3 times the same.
Well,
Tufan sir, any comments?
it's a very nice presentation, quite eye-opening. And I feel to a great extent I can agree to what Dr. Ashwin Mohan has told. Given the fact what he has presented in the history that evolution in a part has been pushed ahead by the psychedelics. We are here, as we are, it has a role. Internally, NMDA is also psychedelic, NMDT, right? And thirdly, we are seeing that ketamine is useful in treatment of depression. All these things indicate that we cannot be harsh on these substances, which are a diverse group of substances. It is our limited understanding that we're keeping them together, but they are not so much to be kept together. And recently, there was a recommendation by Ministry of Social Justice that the law should not be too harsh on the recreational drug users. That is just the inkling that maybe the overall sentiment towards the substances is diminishing. And if it goes further down, we can have more scope to explore its utility for medicinal or other purposes. There should not be no generalist view about psychedelics. It has been there. Even if you don't legalize it, in tribal populations, they use it in different concoctions. They enjoy this. They are not antisocial. It has a place. It has to be explored. Thank you very much. It has to be explored. And next session.
thank you so much, sir, and thank you to the organizers, Dr. Tufan Pati, Alim, Amrit, and everybody, to the chairperson, Dr. Marvalde, Dr. Anuj. Thank you so much for this opportunity, and I hope I was able to do justice to this topic. Thank you.
Very well. Amrit, over to you.
So thank you, Dr. Ashwin Mohan. So we had been, this was a topic which was a little, tough in terms of the advocacy for these topics. A lot of people who are anti-substance, it's their opinion, it's their belief systems which are very, very tight. And I think the last slide of yours summed up our whole attitude towards certain things. So we are all waiting with bated breaths for the next session. We will get a more insightful view of what you have been aiming for. Thank you, Dr. Arun and Dr. Anup Vincent, sir. We expect you to be there next time also, and we'll include you as one of the hosts if you are present. Yes or no, Ali? We'll put the spotlight on them
okay,
also.
thank you.
Thank you. So that would be fine. So thank you, Dr. Tufan. Kya bola?
Dr. Anup's question is also pending. So he
So he will ask the question. He will ask the question himself. So we would expect a full house next time also. With more than 180, 190, it was a little tough topic. It is not a very soft topic. It is not a very generic topic. So we have a lot of people who are hardcore people who would have come and watched this. So 180, 190 hardcore people is a tough thing to gather in these times. I think the next. Sir?
Just 1 minute. On this platform, let us solicit questions from the participants who are so far in this group, and all the questions asked all together we can send to Dr. Ashwin so that he comes quite coordinated for the answers and as well as for the presentation. This will be nice also.
So we will wait for next session. Thank you all our viewers, all our supporters, parent and IPS Odisha State Branch. Thank you so much. Good night. Have a great weekend. Next time, let's have a more psychedelic presentation than Dr. Ashwin.
Okay, good night.
Good night, everybody. Good night.
Good night.
Thank you, boss. Thank you, sir. Everyone.
Welcome. Good night.
Thank you. Good night, everybody. Thanks.
Good night, Topanpati sir.
Thank you, Dr. Marwale. Thank you, Alim. Bye-bye.
We can close the meeting. Shreya, please close the meeting.
Shreya, please close the meeting.